In the year of our Lord, 1187, the cold had settled deep across the northern reaches of the Kingdom of France. The year had been marked by heavy news, the kind that travelled not by rumour alone, but by the weight of letters sealed in wax and carried from one seat of power to another. In October, far to the east, Jerusalem had fallen to the forces of Sultan Salah ad-Din, whom Latin Christendom called Saladin. By November, the word had crossed seas and kingdoms, reaching Rome, where Pope Gregory VIII issued his papal bull Audita Tremendi, calling all able men to take the cross in what would become the Third Crusade. The monks of a Benedictine abbey in Picardy, this very abbey, lived far from the roar of armies, yet the news reached them nonetheless. A courier from Paris had delivered it before the first snows, reading the Pope's words aloud in the chapter house. There was no debate. Such matters were for kings and lords. But the abbey bells had tolled an extra hour that evening, and prayers for the safety of Christ's holy sitter had been added to the daily offices. A Benedictine monastery, by the rule of Saint Benedict written in the 6th century, follows a set pattern for each day, the horarium. It divides time between prayer, work, and study. In winter, the rhythm changes subtly. The nights grow longer, the hours of manual labor shorten, and more time is given to reading and the copying of sacred texts. The cold slows the body, but not the spirit. The abbey itself is old, its foundation laid in the reign of King Louis the Fat. Its church rises in simple Romanesque arches, heavy stone walls holding in the chill as much as the warmth. Around it are the cloisters, a square arcade enclosing a small garden now sleeping under frost, and the ranges that house the refectory, the dormitory, the scriptorium, and the kitchens. Beyond those walls lie the barns, the orchard, and the fish pond, all stilled in winter's grip. In this season, food comes from what was preserved in autumn: salted fish from the river Somme, dried beans and peas, stored apples, rye bread, and beer brewed from the last barley of the year. Heat is a luxury, found only in the kitchen and the warming room. It is here, within these walls, that our winter's day begins. It is the hour before dawn. The world beyond the abbey walls is a white blur of drifting snow, the wind moving in long, patient sighs across the fields. You are standing before the great wooden gates, their iron fittings cold and dark against the pale light of the snow. A small wicket door opens, and a lay brother waves you in without a word. The first thing you notice inside is the muffled quiet. The thick stone walls hold back the wind, and every sound within the cloister, the brush of your boots on the flagged path, the faint creak of a lantern's handle, seems sharper in the stillness. Somewhere above, a bell tolls 3 slow notes, then rests. A narrow path of trodden snow leads beneath the cloister arcade, its columns casting pale shadows in the half-light. The garden at the centre lies in deep frost, herbs bent beneath a white glaze, the fountain dry for the winter. From the dormitory range comes the soft shuffle of sandals against stone. A line of hooded figures emerges, each carrying a small candle whose flame trembles in the draught. Breath curls into the cold air as they walk, unhurried, toward the church. You follow them through the great door, the hinges groaning softly. Inside, the air is just as cold, but the flicker of candles makes the shadows dance across the high stone arches. The smell of beeswax and cold incense hangs in the air. Somewhere in the stalls a voice begins the first antiphon of Matins. The sound is low, resonant, and unbroken, like a river flowing through the dark. The other voices join, weaving a chant that drifts upward and lingers in the vaulting above. You stand quietly, your breath slowing, letting the long, even syllables fold over one another. Outside, the snow falls on without pause, covering the fields, the road, and the tracks that led you here. In the coming hours, the sun will rise pale and thin over the abbey walls, but for now, time moves only with the bell and the chant. The bell's last tone dissolves into the rafters, and for a moment there is only the small restless stir of candle flames. A cantor lifts his hand. In a voice worn smooth by years of the same path through the dark, he intones, Domine labia mea aperis. And from both choir stalls comes the reply, soft and certain, Et os meum annuntiabit laudem tuum. Vigils, Matins begins. The office is long in winter, not to trouble the body, but to give the soul room to breathe. The psalms arrive like slow, steady footfalls along a cloister walk no one has to see to follow. The words are known by heart, more felt than thought. They come in antiphons and responses, the alternation between sides of the choir, a tide that never quite breaks. The air is cold enough that breath curls like incense. The candles make small islands of gold along the carved stalls, and the stone seems to hum a low note of its own. A reader steps forward, lifts a leaf of vellum, and begins the first lesson. Lines from Isaiah, appointed for the season of Advent that has only just begun. The people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. It is not a dramatic reading. It is steady and spare. The words are older than the walls, older than all the men who will ever pass through them. When the reader closes the lesson, a pause settles. The cantor moves the office onward, a responsory, and then another psalm. Somewhere in the nave, a hinge answers the cold with a soft tick. A monk coughs into his sleeve. A wax drop beads on the lip of a candle and slides in slow motion, hardening before it falls. After the second nocturne, the prior adds a quiet collect, an extra prayer these weeks, set down by word from Paris after the Pope's bull in November. The words are simple, without ornament. They ask for mercy upon travellers by sea and land, for wisdom upon rulers, for safety upon those who have assumed the sign of the cross. The brothers do not lift their heads at the phrasing. The intent is understood. No debate, no noise. Only the subtle tightening of a palm around a rosary bead. A memory, perhaps, of a cousin who left a vineyard for the coast last week. A son of a tenant who has already gone to a lord's levee. The world beyond the walls is not theirs to guide, but it is theirs to pray for. The chant resumes. Psalms climb and descend like a quiet hill path seen in winter twilight. The melody never hurries, never insists. It fills the nave, then thins to a single line, then gathers again as more voices breathe into it. At the close of the final responsory of Matins, there is a silence so complete it seems to notch itself into the darkness like a new hour. Lauds follows, day's first praise, even if the day itself has not yet broken. The cantor's pitch is a touch higher now, as if the idea of dawn has entered the room before the light itself. A bell trembles once in the tower, the metal reluctant to move in the cold. Deus in adiutorium meum intende. Domine ad adiuvandum me festina. The psalms of lauds are the ones that lift. They are the psalms that call the whole creation to attention, frost and snow and wind among them. Somewhere in the office come the words of the Laudate, hymns that summon mountains and small creeping things alike to the same purpose. A thin, almost invisible line of steam runs along the lip of a brother's sleeve where it caught the breath he forgot to swallow during the last antiphon. Between psalms, a compact reading is set in place, just a few verses and a short homily paragraph copied decades ago in a clear hand and kept in the book for this season. Gregory the Great's words, still practical after centuries, sit in the room like a familiar tool. Holiness has a shape made of repeated actions. Rise, pray, work, show mercy, return to prayer. In winter, that shape is easier to see. There is a moment near the end of Lauds when the east window grows a shade less dark. Not light, not yet, just the hint that light is possible. No one turns to look, but something quietens further inside the men at prayer, as if each has nodded imperceptibly. The last collect remembers the sick, the poor at the gate, and any traveller who has begged a place by the kitchen fire. There is a single mention, almost a whisper in the Latin, for those on the sea this month, fishermen, couriers, messengers, and for ships bound down the coast to ports that point toward the Levant. The prayer does not name a war. It names danger and the hope of return. The office ends not with applause, not with a sudden movement, but with the careful closing of a book and the softest scrape of benches as the choir rises. Candles are trimmed. The door to the south aisle opens a hand's width and admits a slice of air that smells of snow and smoke and a faint memory of the bakery hearth a building away. One by one the monks pass into the side aisle and through the door into the cloister. The procession is unhurried. No one speaks. A lay brother remains to snuff the last flame by the lectern, pinching the wick between wetted fingers with a practiced, patient motion. Outside the church, the cloister walk holds a dim, pewter light. The garden in the garth is a pattern of white humps, beds asleep under straw and frost, paths half swept by yesterday's broom. The fountain at the center is bound for winter with a wooden lid, a spill of icicles threading from its lip like a fringe of glass beads. A monk in the rear of the line adjusts the rope at his waist, draws his cowl a little closer and lets his gaze pass briefly over the arch that looks west toward the road. The road looks back with no expression at all. There is no speech permitted after Lauds, but a message can pass without words. The cellarer's glance meets the baker's. The baker nods once, a sign that the first loaves have risen well despite the night's cold. The infirmarian's eye meets the porter's. The porter tilts his head minutely toward the gate to say, "One traveller remained. Coughing, we let him in." The prior, without breaking step, touches a fingertip to his breast in acknowledgement of both. By the time the last of the line reaches the south range, the colour of morning has entered the stone. It is not colour as such, closer to the ghost of blue, that suggests the sun is somewhere behind the clouds taking stock of the day. The wind pushes against the arcade and slides along it, a long, slow sigh broken by the regular intervals of columns. With the office ended, the day spreads its map. Kitchen fire, bread, a ladle of warm pottage, the brief reading in the warming room, then work. In winter, the scriptorium is a refuge for fingers that would otherwise go numb outdoors. Not all will copy today. Some will mend tools, some will cut wood, a few will see to the animals, but the steadiness of the scriptorium calls like a low bell you feel rather than hear. Before any of that, though, a small moment of practical mercy. The brothers pass the kitchen door, and the warmth that washes out is a benediction all its own. A lay brother inside lifts a peel to check a loaf and grins without sound at the sight of his shivering elders, as if to say, "Your turn at the hearth is near." Behind them in the church, the candle smoke thins. The books are closed. The breath of chant fades into the stone as if it were always part of the walls, and the walls were merely lending it back for a little while. The south range opens onto a low arched door. From beneath it, a thin ribbon of warm air leaks out into the cloister walk, curling around ankles and carrying the first scent of the day. Rye bread, part baked and earthy, its crust just beginning to form in the oven. Inside, the kitchen is a chamber of stone with a ceiling low enough to hold the heat. The hearth dominates the far wall, its arch blackened with years of smoke, the lintel hung with iron hooks and chains for pots. A fire burns with a deep, steady glow, its light catching the copper of a kettle and the brushed sheen of a ladle's handle. Two lay brothers work without hurry. One tends the bread oven, sliding the long-handled peel beneath a loaf, tapping its crust with a fingertip to test the sound. The other stirs a pot of pottage, a thick winter mixture of barley, leeks, and a little dried fish from the summer's catch. The steam from the pot hangs low in the warm air, carrying the clean scent of leeks softened in fat and the salt edge of the fish. In the corner, a basket of apples rests on a cloth, the skins dull but firm, stored since the autumn harvest, each one turned over weekly to keep rot from spreading. Beside them, a smaller basket holds onions, their papery skins whispering when touched. One of the choir monks enters, hands held out to the hearth as if to greet an old friend. There is no speech, still the hour of silence, but a small smile passes between him and the baker. The monk takes the stool nearest the fire and rests his hands in his sleeves, letting the heat work its way through the wool. On the wall above the bread oven hangs a board for cooling loaves. A few from yesterday rest there, wrapped in a linen cloth. These will be sliced for the midday meal, served with fish and lentils. The new loaves, still pale and swelling, will feed the brothers for the next 2 days. From the far end of the kitchen comes the clink of pottery. The cellarer measures out a small amount of ale for the workers. Thin, lightly brewed, more for safety than for indulgence. The water from the well is clean enough in winter, but the ale is warmer on the stomach. A draught moves through the room as the door to the outer yard opens. The porter steps in, dusted with snow, holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He lays it on the table, nodding to the cook. The bundle opens to reveal a rabbit, snared early in the morning by one of the lay brothers who tends the garden walls. It will be skinned, jointed, and added to tomorrow's pottage. Meat is a rarity in these months, kept for feast days or to restore the sick. The baker lifts the peel again, draws out a loaf, and sets it upright against the hearth to cool its underside. A faint cracking sound rises as the crust adjusts to the cooler air. The smell deepens, rich and nutty from the rye. In the far corner, near the small arched window, a pigeon coos, a winter resident that has made a habit of visiting for crumbs. One of the brothers drops a heel of yesterday's bread on the sill, and the bird flutters down, tilting its head at the steam. From outside, another bell sounds, short and low. The hour of work is beginning, and those who have lingered at the hearth pull their hoods up again. The kitchen door opens, letting in the sharper air of the yard. Beyond it, the sound of the mule in its stall, stamping at the cold, drifts in. As the monks file out toward their appointed tasks, the cook ladles a portion of steaming pottage into a wooden bowl, setting it aside near the fire. This is for the traveller taken in at the gate last night, the one the porter mentioned after Lord's. No words will pass between them. The food will say what's needed. The bread returns to the oven. The pottage stirs on. The fire crackles against the quiet, and the scent of baking and smoke lingers in the folds of every robe that passes through. The scriptorium occupies the upper floor of the east range, its windows narrow and glazed with imperfect glass that bends the winter light into wavering lines. Even on the clearest day, the room is dim. In winter, the light is a thin, cool wash that pools in quiet corners and fades quickly from the long work tables. A brazier glows faintly in the center of the room, more symbolic than effective. The warmth never quite reaches the fingers of the monks seated along the benches, so they work in woolen gloves with the fingertips cut away. Quills scratch over vellum, the sound like a restless insect hidden in the walls. Each desk holds a small arrangement. The text to be copied, a horn of ink made from oak galls steeped with iron salts, a penknife for sharpening the quill, a pumice stone to smooth the page. To one side, a small block of beeswax, pressed with the tip of the quill to keep ink from blotting. Beside one scribe's elbow lies a palette with shallow wells, each holding a different pigment: red from cinnabar, blue from lapis lazuli, green from verdigris. These colors will later illuminate a psalter, destined for a patron in Amiens. The work is quiet but not entirely silent. The stationer, responsible for preparing the pages, steps along the aisle between desks, placing a new leaf here, collecting a finished one there. At one table, a scribe pauses to scrape a line of text from the parchment, the sound delicate and deliberate. Mistakes are not erased, but lifted away in thin curls of vellum, leaving the surface ready for the correct hand. Near the window, a monk bends over a capital letter D drawn in faint lead lines. He traces the curves with a fine brush dipped in gold leaf adhesive, then gently lays the foil across the surface. A wooden burnisher smooths it, the gold catching what little light there is and flaring for an instant before settling into a muted glow. A lay brother enters, carrying a small brazier of coals from the kitchen to replace the fading warmth. Behind him comes the porter, brushing snow from his cloak. He carries a leather pouch sealed with green wax. Without a word, he hands it to the prior, who stands from his work and moves to the small desk at the front of the room. The seal is broken with the tip of a knife. A letter is drawn out, the parchment still cold from the road. The prior reads silently, his eyes moving with an even rhythm, then folds it and tucks it into the sleeve of his habit. He does not speak aloud to the room. This is not the hour for announcements. But a look passes between him and the sub-prior. It is the kind of look that says, more word from Paris, perhaps even from Rome. The porter lingers just long enough to warm his hands over the brazier before retreating to his duties. Snowmelt drips from the hem of his cloak onto the stone floor, forming small, perfect beads before they vanish. At one desk, a younger monk copies from a worn gospel book, his breath clouding faintly as he bends close. He mouths each word silently, as much for the rhythm of the language as for accuracy. The Latin is steady on the page, each letter evenly spaced, each stroke considered. Now and then, the brazier pops softly as a coal shifts. A quill is sharpened with a quick stroke of the penknife, the sound bright in the cool air. The smell of iron gall ink is faint but present, a sour tang beneath the dust of parchment. Through the narrow windows, the day's pale light shows a sky the color of tarnished pewter. Snow falls intermittently, swept sideways by wind before it can settle on the sills. The courtyard below is still and empty except for a lay brother crossing from the barn with a bundle of firewood balanced on his shoulder. The work in the scriptorium continues without reference to the weather. Line by line, page by page, the words are set in place, their shapes and flourishes unchanged whether the world outside is in blossom or in snow. In winter, perhaps, there is more time for such work, fewer hours in the garden or the fields, more in the company of ink and quiet. Somewhere far away, the letter in the prior's sleeve will wait for the appointed time to be read aloud, perhaps at the midday meal. Its news, whatever it may be, will enter the abbey's life like the winter sun, brief, pale, and acknowledged without hurry. For now, the only messages here are the ones the monks send forward in time through the books beneath their hands. The garden lies at the heart of the cloister, but beyond it, tucked behind the east wall, spreads the greater plot. The working kitchen garden, orchard, and herb beds that feed both the body and the infirmary. In summer, it is a tangle of greens, bees, and the warm smell of earth. In winter, it is a map drawn in white and brown, the edges softened by frost and snow. A narrow door in the east range opens onto the yard. The first step outside is a shock. The air is sharper, the light brighter for the way it glances off the snow. A monk draws his cowl close and pulls a pair of wool-lined mitts over his half-finger gloves. He pauses a moment, letting his eyes adjust, then crosses the yard to the garden gate. Inside, the pathways are kept just wide enough for a barrow. The beds are mounded under straw and snow, their edges marked by the stubble of last season's growth. A row of cabbage stalks, stripped of leaves, stands like a line of thin sentinels. The dormant herb beds hold their shape beneath the frost. Rosemary, thyme, sage, all grey-green and stiff, their leaves waiting for the longer sun. These herbs, cut and dried before winter, hang in bunches in the infirmary, ready for teas, poultices, and the simmering pots that steam the sick-room air. Two brothers work with slow precision, clearing ice from the path between the beds. One uses a wooden rake to loosen the packed snow. The other follows with a broom of bundled twigs, brushing the path clean to the hard earth beneath. This is not done for beauty alone. The cleared paths make it easier to reach the store cellars without slipping, and they keep the damp from seeping into the walls. In the small orchard, the apple trees are bare, their branches etched against the winter sky. A few withered fruits remain, clinging stubbornly until the wind takes them. The orchard gate is left ajar so the mule can graze the sparse winter grass between the trees. At the far end of the garden, a low door leads into the root cellar. Here the air is cool but steady, the smell earthy and faintly sweet. Stored apples rest in shallow wooden trays, each one wrapped in straw. Turnips and carrots are piled in bins, the dirt still clinging to their skins to keep them from drying out. A monk checks them one by one, setting aside any with soft spots to be cooked that day. In the corner, a few wheels of cheese sit on a shelf, their rinds mottled with bloom, still young, still sharp. Above ground again, the wind has shifted. Clouds draw closer, dimming the sharpness of the light. The brothers in the garden pull their cloaks tighter and move toward the chicken coop along the garden wall. The hens mutter softly inside, scratching through the straw for scraps. In winter they lay less, sometimes none at all for days, but the care is the same. A small handful of grain is scattered, and the hens bustle forward, their breath misting faintly in the air. From beyond the wall comes the muffled clop of hooves on the road. A cart passes, the driver bent low in his cloak against the wind, perhaps bound for Amiens, perhaps for a nearer market. His breath and the mule's form, small clouds that trail briefly behind him before dissolving. A bell rings faintly from within the abbey. The brothers straighten, lean their brooms against the wall, and head for the gate. Their boots crunch in the snow, leaving a brief pattern of dark prints that will soften and vanish before the day is done. As the garden gate closes, the wind stirs the rosemary and sets a faint scent into the cold air, enough to follow them a step or two toward the cloister, a thread of summer in the grip of winter. The windows here face south, and in summer they pour light across the benches. In winter, the sun only grazes the upper panes, sending narrow ladders of brightness down onto the floor. The air inside is warmer than the cloister, though still cool by most measures. The heat comes partly from the small hearth in the corner, but mostly from the presence of dozens of robed figures gathering together. A faint smell of baking bread lingers, mingled with the sharper tang of salted fish being portioned into wooden trenchers. In the Benedictine manner, the meal begins in silence. Brothers take their assigned seats. Each has a place, and these do not change except by order. No one sits before the prior gives the signal. When all are in place, the reader steps up to the pulpit fixed to one wall, its little stair curling upward. He holds a volume bound in leather, worn soft at the edges. Today's reading is from the life of Saint Martin of Tours, chosen to match the Advent season. The voice begins, calm and measured, filling the hall without strain. When the blessed Martin was yet a soldier of men, he met at the gate of the city a poor man naked, and he, having naught but his cloak, drew his sword and cut it in two. The story moves on as food is brought. This is the principal meal of the day. especially in winter. Each brother receives a slice of bread from the morning's baking, a portion of lentils boiled until soft, and a small serving of salted herring laid over the top. From a shared pitcher, ale is poured into simple pottery cups, thin but malty, enough to quench the thirst. The only sounds are the reader's voice, the quiet clink of wooden spoons, and the occasional scrape of a bench leg shifting on the stone floor. A lay brother passes between the rows to refill trenchers or bring more bread. His sandals whisper against the flagstones. At the high table, the prior eats with the same fare as the rest, breaking his bread into the lentils and taking small, even bites. The letter received in the scriptorium earlier rests folded at his side. It will be read aloud after the meal, when the reader's appointed text is finished. The warmth of the bread softens the salted edge of the fish, the lentils giving a mild, earthy sweetness. For those who worked outside in the garden, the heat rising from the bowl is as much a blessing as the food itself. The brothers eat slowly, their eyes often lowered, listening more to the reading than to their own hunger. The story of Saint Martin concludes with a description of his death, and the reader closes the book gently, resting his hands upon it until the final spoonfuls are taken. A short silence follows, during which the faint crackle of the corner fire is the only sound. Then the prior unfolds the letter. His voice is quiet, but carries to the far end of the hall. Word has come from the bishop's seat in Amiens. The call of our Holy Father is confirmed. Messengers are to be sent across the realm, and aid prepared for those who will take the cross in the spring. No reaction breaks the quiet. The rule forbids idle talk at table, but some glance briefly at one another, a flicker of thought crossing the stillness. They will not discuss it here, but the knowledge will travel with them through the rest of the day. A final blessing is given, and all stand. The benches slide back with a low wooden sigh. The trenchers are gathered, the ale cups stacked. The brothers file out as they came in, the silence holding until they are clear of the hall. Outside, the air seems sharper after the warmth within. The bell sounds again, lighter this time, calling the monks to the short office of sext in the church before they return to their work. The infirmary occupies a low south-facing building along the outer wall of the abbey. Its windows are larger than most, built to let in the sun when it appears, and shuttered against the wind when it does not. The walls inside are hung with woolen cloths to keep the chill from the stone, their dyes faded by time and washing. The air here is warmer than most of the abbey, the heat coming from a small hearth at one end and the constant simmer of a pot set above the coals. The infirmarian, a monk trained in the use of herbs, moves quietly between the beds. Each is little more than a wooden frame with a straw mattress and a folded blanket, but the smell in the room is clean and sharp, rosemary, thyme, and a little vinegar in a basin for washing hands. On a shelf nearby, small glazed jars hold dried leaves and powders, comfrey for bruises, yarrow for wounds, mint for easing the stomach, horehound for coughs. In the bed nearest the hearth lies the traveller taken in at the gate the night before. His face is pale, his breath shallow, and the cough that escapes him now and then is low but persistent. The infirmarian ladles a cup of the rosemary steam from the pot, places it beside the bed, and gestures for him to breathe it in. The man obeys slowly, closing his eyes as the heat rises against his face. At the far end of the room, another patient, an older brother from the abbey, rests with his feet wrapped in linen strips. Frostbite from a trip to the fish pond earlier in the week has left the skin tender and white. The infirmarian checks the wrapping, smoothing them gently and tucking them back into place. No words are exchanged. The touch itself is reassurance. A lay brother enters carrying a basket from the kitchen. Inside are 2 small loaves, still warm, and a cup of thin ale. He sets them on the table, nods once to the infirmarian, and departs. These will be divided between the patients as they're able to eat. For the traveller, a heel of bread softened in hot broth. For the older brother, a small portion with a little cheese. Light shifts slowly across the floor as the clouds outside move. For a brief moment, the sun slips between them, and the room brightens. Dust motes drift lazily in the warm air above the hearth. The infirmarian uses the light to sort a small bundle of dried rose hips, removing any that are too darkened to keep. These will be crushed into a powder rich in sharp sweetness, stirred into warm water for those with a fever. From beyond the walls comes the faint sound of axes striking wood, brothers cutting fuel for the night's fires. The steady rhythm enters the infirmary like a second heartbeat. A cough joins it, softer now, and the sound of liquid being sipped from the cup. When the traveller drifts into sleep, the infirmarian moves to the small writing desk by the window. He opens a narrow ledger bound in plain hide and makes a careful note. On the feast of St. Lucy, a man of middle years taken in at the gate with cough and chill, given rosemary vapour, bread in broth, to rest by the fire. He closes the ledger, sets down the quill and returns to the hearth. The pot still simmers, fragrant with the green sharpness of herbs. He stirs it once, the spoon circling slowly, and the sound of wood on iron merges with the muted crackle of the coals. After none, the short mid-afternoon office, the monks disperse again, some returning to the scriptorium, others to outdoor labour. Winter shortens the list of tasks, but there is always work to be done to keep the abbey running smoothly. In the outer yard, near the woodshed, two brothers work side by side splitting logs. The ground beneath them is packed with frost-hardened earth, scattered with chips of pale wood. One stands the round on its end and steps back. The other swings the axe in a clean arc, the crack of the split ringing against the cold air. Steam curls from their breath, vanishing as quickly as it forms. Each piece is stacked neatly in the shed, the ends turned outward so the wind can move between them. Near the stable, the mule stamps at the ground, impatient for fresh hay. A lay brother forks the hay from the loft above, letting it tumble in soft yellow heaps into the manger. The animal's ears swivel at every sound, and when the brother strokes its neck, it leans into the touch with a slow, contented sigh. Along the garden wall, another monk mends the wheel of a small barrow. The rim had loosened in the damp, so he works with a mallet and wedge, tightening the iron hoop back into place. His tools rest in a tidy line beside him, a file, a small adze, a strip of rawhide for lashing. He hums quietly, not a hymn, but the kind of tuneless hum that comes from muscle memory and long practice. From the barn, the smell of straw and stored grain drifts into the yard. A pair of chickens scratch in the dust near the doorway, their feathers fluffed against the cold. Now and then, they give a soft, conversational cluck, as if reminding each other that even in winter there is food to be found. A little farther off, by the wall that borders the lane, the porter checks the hinges of the small postern gate. The iron has stiffened in the frost, so he works oil into the joints, opening and closing it until the swing is smooth again. He pauses once to glance down the lane, empty for now, except for a scatter of footprints leading toward the village. The sounds of the yard mingle together, the steady thunk of axe on wood, the soft rip of hay being pulled from the loft, the muted clang of iron on iron as the wheel rim is tightened. Every so often, a crow calls from the bare orchard, its voice harsh in the stillness. Above it all, the abbey tower keeps its quiet watch. The bell will not sound again until Vespers, but its dark shape against the pale sky is reminder enough of the rhythm that governs the place. Here, Even in the heart of winter, the day has its measure, each task finding its hour, each hour finding its work. As the shadows lengthen, the brothers in the yard finish their work. The last armful of wood is stacked, the barrow's wheel spins without wobble, the mule's manger is full. Tools are gathered and returned to their hooks. The yard begins to empty, the air holding the scent of fresh-cut wood and clean hay. Over the garden wall the sun tilts low, its light faint but golden where it touches the tops of the cloister arches. In the quiet that follows the end of work, a single gust of wind lifts a swirl of frost from the ground, spinning it briefly into the air before letting it fall. The refectory feels different in the evening. The tall windows are black mirrors now, reflecting only the candlelight and the movement within. Shadows pool under the tables and the air is warmer, some from the hearth, some from the closeness of the company gathered. The evening meal is smaller than middays, but no less welcome. On the tables tonight, bowls of thick barley porridge, a wedge of soft cheese for each brother, and a small pot of honey to be shared along the length of the bench. The bread is yesterday's, firmer now, its crust softened when dipped into the porridge. A small jug of ale sits near the high table, ready to be poured into cups as needed. Unlike the midday meal, this is an hour when quiet conversation is allowed. Voices are still kept low, as if mindful not to disturb the peace of the building itself, but the murmur of speech is a comfort after the day's labor and silences. A young monk at the far end of the table leans slightly toward the brother beside him and begins to recount a short tale, one he's heard from the porter about a peddler who passed the abbey a week ago. The peddler had been caught in a snowstorm near the forest and claimed to have been guided to safety by the faint sound of church bells, though there was no village within miles. The brothers smile quietly at this, some nodding as if they've heard such stories before. At the high table, the prior speaks softly with the cellarer about the state of the stores, whether the apples will last to Lent, if the cheese wheels in the cool room have kept their mould in check. It is practical talk, but even this feels part of the season's rhythm. Now and then, laughter ripples gently from one end of the hall to the other, quickly settling back into the steady hum. A few brothers speak of saints whose feast days are coming soon, recalling small miracles or curious traditions from their youth in other villages. One tells of Saint Amandus, patron of brewers, and how his own father swore the ale was always sweeter when brewed in February on the Saint's Day. The hearth at the far end is fed a new log, sending up a burst of sparks before the flames settle into a steady glow. The light flickers over the walls, catching the iron fittings of the serving spoons and the curve of the pottery bowls. Toward the end of the meal, the porter steps in from the cold, brushing snow from his shoulders. He pauses just inside, waiting for the prior's nod before speaking. "A rider passed on the road to Amiens," he says quietly. "Said the king's men have begun to muster at Tours." No more is said. The news is taken in, added silently to the greater understanding of the world beyond the walls. The porter takes his seat, warming his hands around his cup. The bowl's empty, the last crusts of bread are divided, and the honey pot is scraped clean. The brothers sit for a moment longer, speaking in ones and twos, letting the fire's warmth soak into their robes before the next bell calls them to the church for compline. When they do rise, it is without hurry. Benches slide back, bowls are gathered, and the door to the cloister opens to admit the sharp night air. The warmth of the refectory lingers like a cloak as they cross the stones, their steps guided now by candlelight alone. bell for Compline is lighter than the great calls of the day. It strokes closer together, as though reminding all within the walls that the day is nearly done. From the refectory and workrooms, brothers drift toward the church, their steps softened by the thick hush of night. The cloister is lit by small horn lanterns hanging from the arches, their light a pale amber shimmer that reaches only a few feet before giving way to the dark. Inside the nave, the candles along the choir stalls are already lit. The air here feels stiller than at Vespers, the kind of stillness that comes when all that must be done has been done. A faint scent of resin from the fresh log in the hearth at supper still lingers on the robes of those taking their seats. The cantor begins without preamble, Converte nos, Deus salutaris noster, e averte iram tuam a nobis. The psalms of Compline are shorter, their tone more intimate, words of rest and trust placed into the hands of the night. The chant moves slowly, the notes low enough to feel in the chest rather than hear with the ears alone. The sound seems to cling to the air even after each phrase ends, folding into the shadows high in the vaults. A reading follows, taken from the first epistle of Peter. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. The words are familiar, a final caution before the descent into sleep. The lector's voice is steady, unhurried, the syllables landing like measured footfalls on a long, quiet path. Then comes the confession. All bow their heads together, the rustle of wool on wood blending into a single soft sigh. The prior's voice rises alone for the absolution, firm but gentle, before the choir resumes with the final prayers. The Nunc Dimittis, Simeon's song, brings the service toward its close. Nunc dimittis servum tum, Domine, secundum verbum tum in pace. Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace. The last notes fade into silence. The candles are extinguished one by one, the smoke curling briefly upward before disappearing into the darkness. The brothers file out into the cloister in the same quiet order they arrived. By now, the night has deepened. The sky beyond the cloister garth is black, save for a scattering of cold, sharp stars. Frost rims the edges of the stonework, catching the lantern light in pale glints. They walk in single file toward the dormitory, each carrying the quiet of the service with them. At the threshold, sandals are removed and set neatly aside. The dormitory is long and low, the bed simple, a wooden frame, a straw mattress, a blanket folded tight. Some kneel briefly beside their beds before lying down. Others simply lower themselves into the straw, pulling the blanket over their shoulders with the slow care of those whose movements are set by habit. The only sounds are the faint shift of blankets and the occasional cough from the far end of the room. Within minutes the dormitory is still. Outside, the wind moves along the cloister walls, touching each corner of the abbey like a hand passing over a book it knows well. The abbey sleeps. The dormitory is quiet, but for the slow rhythm of breathing, the faint shift of straw under a sleeper's weight. Outside, the cloister garth lies under a thin new layer of snow. The paths half vanished, the fountain at its centre sealed under its wooden lid. The garden walls stand black against the white ground, their tops dusted like the edges of a page. The moon is high, spilling a silver light that catches in the frost on the cloister columns. Between the arches the shadows stretch long, broken only where the lantern at the porter's door burns through the night. Its light is small but steady, a signal to any who might approach from the road that the abbey watches, even in sleep. Snow falls softly, each flake drifting and turning before it settles. The sound is not so much heard as felt, a hush that deepens the silence rather than breaking it. The wind is low now, passing gently over the roof tiles, circling the tower before moving on toward the fields. In the church the great door is barred, but inside the nave the air still carries a faint scent of beeswax and stone, warmed by candlelight. The choir stalls wait in perfect stillness. The books closed. The last wax drips hardened along the edges of the holders. The presence of the day's prayers lingers like a low note long after the choir has ceased to sing. Somewhere in the outer yard, the mule shifts in its stall, hooves muffled in the hay. A chicken rustles in the coop, then settles again. Beyond the walls, the road is empty, the last cart having passed before sunset. The night watchman makes his slow circuit, his sandals whispering over the stone. At each turn of the cloister he pauses, not out of fear, but in the quiet instinct to listen. He hears only the faintest creak of the wooden gate in the breeze and the slow drip of meltwater from the eaves where the day's sun softened the snow. When his path takes him past the garth, he stops a moment to look inward. The snow there is unbroken, smooth as a blank page. He knows that come morning, the first tracks across it will be those of brothers walking to Matins, their sandals leaving dark marks in the pale surface. His circuit complete, the watchman returns to his place by the porter's lodge. He sits with his cloak pulled tight, the lantern beside him, and listens to the night's quiet. The kind of quiet that feels older than the walls themselves. Hours will pass this way, the snow falling and the stars slowly wheeling overhead. And in the dormitory, in the infirmary, in the stable, all who sleep will remain in the deep shelter of the abbey, held by its walls and its rhythm until the bell calls again. In the darkness, the world beyond these walls continues. Rivers freezing, roads winding toward distant towns, kings speaking of war, but here, in the cloister's heart, the only journey tonight is the one that leads from waking into rest. The lantern burns, the snow falls, the monastery keeps its watch.